In the first week of August 1940, paper started falling on England. It came down over Somerset in the early hours, over Hampshire, over the quiet green fields around Stratford-upon-Avon, drifting out of a dark sky while the sirens said nothing, because there was nothing to shoot at. Farmers found the sheets caught in hedgerows at first light. Children picked them up on the way to school. Each one was printed in English, on cheap stock, under a title that had been chosen with some care, A Last Appeal to Reason. Inside was an abridged translation of a speech given in Berlin 2 weeks earlier by the Chancellor of Germany. The English did not read them and tremble. They read them and laughed. Somebody in Gloucestershire started auctioning them off in the pub for £1 apiece, with the money going to the Red Cross. Others were sold for the Spitfire Fund, so that the German case for peace ended up buying British fighters. One collection raised enough for a small stack of parts. There is a photograph from that summer of a woman holding up a leaflet at a village fete with a cash tin at her elbow, grinning like she has just been handed free money, because she has. It is a good story, and it usually gets told as a joke. But if you stop laughing for a second and look at those leaflets from the other direction, from the side that printed them and loaded them into bomb bays, they are not funny at all. They are the last, slightly desperate gesture of a government that genuinely could not understand what it was dealing with, because Berlin was not bluffing in July 1940. That is the part that gets flattened out of the retelling. The offer was real. The confusion behind it was real. And the men who made it had spent 6 weeks waiting for an answer from London that they were absolutely certain was coming, and it did not come, and they could not work out why. To understand how baffled they were, you have to understand how close they came to being right. Start with what Germany could see. In the second week of June 1940, the German army was in Paris. France, the strongest land power in Europe, the country that had held the line for 4 years in the last war and buried 1.5 million of its own men doing it, had been broken in under 6 weeks. Not besieged, not ground down. Broken in the time it takes to get through a summer. And Britain's army had run. That is how it looked on a map in a headquarters, and honestly, it is not an unfair reading. Something over 300,000 men had come off the beaches at Dunkirk, and the evacuation was a genuine deliverance, but they came off with what they could carry and nothing else. Everything heavy stayed behind. The precise figures were tallied up afterwards, and they make grim reading. Something like 2,500 guns, 60-odd thousand vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, 500,000 tons of stores and ammunition, all of it abandoned on the sand and in the ditches along the road to the coast. Nearly 700 tanks. Photographs taken by German troops walking into Dunkirk in June show trucks nose down in the shallows for as far as the lens can reach. Back in England, the men who had escaped were reorganized in fields and requisitioned schools, and for a period that summer, the British Army could field a genuinely embarrassing number of properly equipped divisions. Home Guard units were drilling with shotguns, pikes, and in more than one documented case, wooden rifles. There were coastal stretches where the anti-invasion plan amounted to a hope and a farm gate. So a German staff officer looking at the ledger in June 1940 sees this. France gone. Belgium gone. Holland gone. Norway gone. Denmark gone. Poland gone. The British Army disarmed by its own retreat. The British on an island, alone, with no ally on the continent, with the United States neutral and inclined to stay that way, and with the Soviet Union not merely neutral, but actively shipping Germany oil, grain, and manganese under a trade agreement. And the officer thinks reasonably, they will talk. Of course they will talk. Any government would talk. There was another layer to it, and this one came from Hitler personally, and it is stranger. He did not particularly want to destroy Britain. He said so, repeatedly in private, to people who had no reason to invent it afterwards. He regarded the British Empire as a functioning piece of world architecture, a thing that held large parts of the planet in order, run by a race he considered close kin to his own. Smashing it, in his own analysis, would not benefit Germany. It would benefit America and Japan, who would divide the pieces. He wanted the British to stay out of Europe and keep their empire and leave him a free hand in the East. In his mind, that was not humiliation. It was a bargain, and a generous one. Which is exactly why the refusal, when it came, hit him like an insult rather than a policy. Now go back 3 weeks, to a set of rooms in London, where Britain came genuinely close to giving him what he wanted. Late May 1940. Churchill has been Prime Minister for a little over 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He is not yet the granite figure of the newsreels. He is a man with a long, loud, and in many quarters, deeply unpopular political record, installed in office by a crisis, distrusted by a large part of his own party, and presiding over a 5-man war cabinet that contains 2 former or future rivals, and 1 man who very nearly got the job instead of him. That man is Edward Wood, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. And it is worth being fair to Halifax, because the cartoon version of him does not survive contact with the record. He is not a coward, and he is not a fool. He is tall, thin, formal, half-blind in one eye, and born without a left hand, which he concealed with an artificial one in a glove. He had been Viceroy of India. He had sat across a table from Hitler at Berchtesgaden in 1937, and famously almost handed him his coat, having mistaken him for a footman. He was the establishment's first choice for Prime Minister in May 1940, and he had turned it down, partly because he sat in the House of Lords, and partly because he seems to have understood he was not the man for the kind of war that was coming. And by the last week of May, he has looked at the map and reached a conclusion that a great many sensible people shared. France is finished. The army is trapped on a beach and will probably be lost. If Britain is going to have to come to terms eventually, then the worst possible moment to do it is after the army is destroyed and the cities are burning. You get better terms while you still have something to bargain with. Better to find out now, quietly, what is actually on offer. He even had a route. Italy had not yet entered the war. Mussolini was hovering, waiting to see which way it fell, and he had his own list of grievances about Malta, Gibraltar, Suez, and the Mediterranean generally. Halifax's idea was to approach Mussolini as a mediator, offer him something to keep him neutral, and see whether a wider European settlement could be sounded out through Rome. On the 25th of May, Halifax went ahead and did part of it. He met the Italian ambassador in London, Giuseppe Bastianini, and let it be understood that Britain would be willing to consider matters of Italian concern as part of a general settlement in Europe. He did not have cabinet authority for that conversation. He was opening a door a few inches to see what was behind it. The next day, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud flew to London and pushed in the same direction. Reynaud was drowning. He wanted Britain to go in with France on a joint approach to Mussolini, and there is a moment in the record of those talks that ought to be better known than it is, where the question is put in the bluntest possible commercial terms. If the Allies could get out of the present difficulty by conceding Malta, Gibraltar, and a few African colonies, would that not be worth doing? That was the shape of it, not surrender. A deal. Give up some real estate, keep the country. The War Cabinet met 9 times between the 26th and the 28th of May. 9 meetings in 3 days, moving between the Cabinet Room at Downing Street, Admiralty House, and a room at the House of Commons because the Prime Minister had to be near the chamber. The 5 men were Churchill, Halifax, Neville Chamberlain, Clement Attlee, and Arthur Greenwood. Attlee and Greenwood were Labour, and they were solidly against negotiation. Halifax was for exploring it. Churchill was against, which left Chamberlain in the middle, and Chamberlain mattered more than anybody in that room except Churchill, because Chamberlain, not Churchill, was still leader of the Conservative Party. He controlled the votes. If he moved against Churchill, Churchill was finished within a week. Churchill's argument across those 3 days was not the one people assume. He did not stand up and say that Britain must fight because fighting is noble. He argued mechanics. He said that a nation which enters negotiations from a position of weakness does not negotiate at all. It receives terms. The moment Britain sat down, The Germans would name their price, and the price would be the Royal Navy, or naval bases, or disarmament, or a friendly government in London, and once you have given up the fleet, you have given up the ability to say no ever again. You do not get a lenient peace. You get a chain, fitted politely. And he said something else, which was harder-headed still. He said that Britain's bargaining position would not be worse in 3 months. If the Germans came and were beaten in the air and on the sea, Britain's position would be enormously better. And if things went badly, the offer of terms would still be there, because Hitler would still want them. There was no expiry date on capitulation. There was possibly an expiry date on victory. Halifax found this unbearable. His diary entry for the 27th of May contains the phrase most quoted from the entire crisis, that Churchill was talking, in his words, the most frightful rot. He also recorded that he told Churchill privately he could not go on working like this, and that if the differences continued, he would resign. That threat is the hinge of the whole thing, not the speeches, the threat. Because if Halifax had walked out in the last week of May 1940, taking with him his standing with the Conservative Party, his weight in the Lords, and the enormous respectability he carried in a country that liked respectability, Churchill's government would very probably have fallen. And the government that replaced it would have been formed by people whose central complaint was that Churchill would not talk. There is no law of nature that says Britain fights on. There is a 5-man committee, and a man in it with his hand on the door. 2 things stopped it. The first was Chamberlain. He came down on Churchill's side on the 28th, and once he had, the argument was over in arithmetic terms, even if Halifax kept talking. It is a small thing in the record, and a very large thing in fact, and it is worth pausing on, because Chamberlain is the man history has decided to remember for an umbrella and a piece of paper. He was also, at that moment, in constant pain from an abdominal cancer that nobody had yet named, and that would kill him within 6 months. He knew his reputation was gone. He had nothing to gain from any of it. He backed the war. The second thing was that Churchill went around the problem entirely. On the evening of the 28th of May, with the cabinet deadlocked, he called together the ministers who were not in the war cabinet. 25 men or so, the wider government, people who ran departments and had no say in grand strategy, and had spent 3 days hearing nothing. They assembled in his room at the House of Commons. Several of them wrote it down afterwards, so we have a decent idea of what happened. He gave them the situation straight, including the possibility that most of the army on the far side of the Channel might be lost. He told them he had considered whether Britain should negotiate, and that he had concluded it was useless, that a Britain which made terms would become a slave state under a puppet government, and that the only outcome worth having was the one you could not get by asking. And then, according to Hugh Dalton, who wrote it in his diary that night, he finished with a line about how, if this Long Island story of theirs was to end at last, it had better end with each of them lying on the ground choking in his own blood. The room went up. Dalton describes men shouting, getting out of their chairs, coming round the table to slap him on the back. Churchill, who was not a man given to underestimating his own performances, said later that he had been surprised by it, that he had expected these solid Whitehall figures to be alarmed, and instead found them ready. He walked back into the War Cabinet with 25 ministers behind him. And that was that. Halifax was not sacked, because Churchill could not afford to break with the Conservative Party, and he stayed on as Foreign Secretary and went on doing his job. But the question of terms was closed, and it was never seriously reopened. Here is the detail that I keep coming back to. The British public did not know. Not one word of it. The 9 meetings, the Italian Channel, Reynaud's proposal, Halifax's resignation threat, all of it went into the cabinet minutes and the private diaries and stayed there. The minutes were closed for 30 years. Most people in Britain went to their graves believing what they had been told at the time, which was that there had never been a moment's hesitation. So on the 4th of June, as the last men come off Dunkirk, Churchill stands up in the Commons and gives the speech about fighting on the beaches and the landing grounds and the streets and never surrendering, and the whole country hears iron. What they cannot hear is that 7 days earlier, the same government came within one man's resignation of finding out Berlin's price. On the 18th of June, he tells them the Battle of France is over and the Battle of Britain is about to begin. On the 22nd, France signs an armistice with Germany in the forest at Compiègne, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed in 1918, which Hitler had specifically ordered, pulled out of a museum, and towed back to the exact spot for the purpose. He sat in Marshal Foch's chair for a few minutes, listened to the preamble, then got up and walked out and left the details to Keitel. Britain was now alone, and in Berlin, the phone did not ring. This is the part of the story where the two sides stop being able to see each other, and it is genuinely disorienting to read the German records from that summer, because they are full of people waiting for post. And they were not waiting for no reason. This is what almost nobody tells you about July 1940. Berlin had been picking up signals. On the 17th of June, the Swedish minister in London, Björn Prytz, sent a telegram to Stockholm reporting a conversation he had just had at the Foreign Office. He had bumped into R.A. Butler, the junior Foreign Office minister, and by Prytz's account, Butler had said that common sense and not bravado would dictate British policy, and had then gone away and come back with a message understood to be from Halifax himself, to the effect that no opportunity would be neglected for a compromise peace if reasonable terms could be agreed, and that no diehards would be allowed to stand in the way. Whether Butler actually said that, and in what tone, and how much Prytz added in the retelling, has been argued over ever since. Butler denied the sense of it. Churchill found out and was furious, and there was a formal reprimand. But the telegram existed, it went to Stockholm, and Stockholm in the summer of 1940 was a sieve. That kind of thing does not stay in a Swedish filing cabinet. Berlin heard in June 1940, from a neutral diplomatic source, that a compromise peace was live inside the British Foreign Office. Then there was Lisbon. The Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, had fled France ahead of the German advance and arrived in Portugal in early July with his wife. No job, a great deal of resentment, and a documented history of warm feelings toward Germany. He had toured the country in 1937 as a guest of the regime. He was, in German eyes, a man who had been removed from the British throne by exactly the establishment that was now refusing to make peace, and who might be persuaded to make himself available if that establishment ever fell. Ribbentrop sent Walter Schellenberg, an SD intelligence officer, to Portugal to work on him. The operation had a code name, Willie. The plan involved persuading the Duke not to take up the post Churchill had hurriedly invented for him, Governor of the Bahamas, which was a posting designed chiefly to put an ocean between him and Europe. The Germans tried rumors, they tried intermediaries, they tried an offer of money and safety, and at one point they seemed to have considered whether he could simply be induced to cross into Spain and stay there. Windsor stalled, complained, negotiated about his wife's status, and then on the 1st of August 1940 boarded a ship for the Bahamas, and the whole thing collapsed. But look at what it tells you about the German picture. They believed there was a British establishment that wanted out. They believed there was a former king who might front it. They believed the Churchill government was a temporary spasm. They were not hallucinating. They were reading a real thing badly. The peace faction had existed. It had lost in secret on the 28th of May, and nobody had told Berlin, because there was nobody to tell. Through late June and early July, Hitler waited. Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, kept a diary throughout, and it is full of a commander who cannot get an answer out of his own head of state. Halder records Hitler being preoccupied with why Britain will not move, and reaching for explanations. On the 13th of July, he writes that Hitler is bothered by the question, and that Hitler's own reading is that Britain is holding out because it is hoping for Russia. Sit with that for a moment, because that thought does not go away. It becomes the largest thing in the war. Meanwhile, the practical planning drifted. There was no German invasion plan for Britain in June 1940 in any serious sense, because nobody had expected to need one. The Navy had lost a painful amount of its surface strength off Norway in April. There were no purpose-built landing craft. The whole idea rested on collecting river barges from the canals of Europe, towing them across the Channel, and hoping. On the 16th of July, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for a landing operation against England. It got the name Sea Lion. And the first sentence of that directive is the most revealing document of the entire summer, because it opens by complaining. It says that since England, despite the hopelessness of her military situation, still shows no sign of willingness to come to an understanding, he has decided to prepare and, if necessary, carry out a landing. The hopelessness of her military situation. That was not propaganda for foreign consumption. That was a top-secret order to his own commanders. That was what Berlin actually believed. 3 days later, he tried once more, and he made a show of it. The Reichstag was summoned for the evening of Friday the 19th of July at the Kroll Opera House, which had served as the Parliament building since the Reichstag fire in 1933. The session was folded together with a victory celebration for the fall of France, so before he said anything about peace, Hitler handed out rewards, and he handed out a lot of them at once. 12 officers were promoted to Field Marshal in a single ceremony. 9 from the army: Brauchitsch, Keitel, Rundstedt, Bock, Leib, List, Kluge, Witzleben, Reichenau, and 3 from the Luftwaffe: Milch, Kesselring, Sperle. To grasp how extraordinary that is, you have to know that Imperial Germany had been miserly with the rank, and that the German army had gone through the whole of the First World War creating only a handful. Hitler produced 12 in an evening. Some of them were visibly startled, and then, because the top of the list was already occupied, he invented a new rank for Hermann Göring alone. Reichsmarschall. Marshal of the Reich, senior to every field marshal, with a specially designed baton and a specially designed uniform, and the public confirmation that Göring remained his designated successor. Göring, whose Air Force was about to be handed the job of finishing Britain off, stood there and received a rank that had never existed before and would never be given to anyone else. In the diplomatic seats sat an American radio correspondent named William Shearer, who had been reporting from Berlin for years, and who had watched Hitler perform often enough to be a connoisseur. Shearer wrote that night that this was Hitler as conqueror and entirely aware of it, and that he was a superb actor, and that his control of a German audience was a thing worth studying even when the content made you ill. He also noticed the man sitting near him, the Italian foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, in the black and gray of the fascist militia, who kept springing up to give the salute every time Hitler drew breath, clutching a copy of a speech that Shearer doubted he could follow. The speech ran over 2 hours. Most of it was a settling of accounts with the war so far, the campaign in the West narrated as a triumph, the usual construction of Germany as the wronged party. And then near the end he turned to Britain, and the tone changed. And this is where you can hear a man trying to be magnanimous and not quite having the equipment for it. He said he was speaking not as a defeated man asking favors, but as a victor speaking in the name of reason. He said he saw no reason why the war should go on. He said that he could see a great empire being destroyed, an empire he had never intended to harm, and that this was not what he had wanted. And then the line that everyone in that hall understood as the actual content of the offer, that the struggle, if it continued, could only end with the complete destruction of one side or the other, and that Mr. Churchill might believe it would be Germany, but that he knew it would be Britain. Come to terms, or be annihilated. That was the whole of it. He wrapped it in personal contempt for Churchill, calling him a warmonger who wrecked nations for a living, and sneering that when Germany won, Churchill would already be in Canada, where the money and the children of the war party had supposedly been shipped for safekeeping. What the offer conspicuously did not contain was terms. There was no list, no demand about the fleet, no figure for the colonies, no timetable. It was an invitation to be sensible, deliberately left vague, and several neutral observers in the hall came away worried precisely because it was vague. Vagueness is what you offer a government you expect to say yes, because you want them at the table before you tell them the price. Some of the diplomats in the Kroll that night went back to their embassies genuinely concerned that the British might take it, because it was so easy to take. The German press ran it exactly as designed. Magnanimity from a victor. The radio carried it across Europe, and in London, in a BBC studio, a man had been sitting listening to the whole thing in the original German, and he had made a decision. His name was Sefton Delmer, and of all the people who could have been in that chair, it is hard to imagine a worse one for Hitler. Delmer was British, and he had been born in Berlin. His father was an Australian-born professor of English literature at Berlin University, and when the First World War broke out, the family was interned as enemy aliens in the city where they lived. Sefton went to a German school. He grew up bilingual to the point where Germans could not place him as a foreigner. He came to England as a boy of about 10, who spoke better German than English and got bullied for the accent. In 1928, the Daily Express sent him back to Berlin to open a bureau, and he did something none of his competitors could do. He got inside the Nazi Party while it was still a fringe act. He was the first British journalist to interview Hitler. He got close to Rome. He flew on Hitler's campaign aircraft during the elections of 1932 in the cabin, watching him work the crowds from town to town. He walked through the smoking Reichstag on the night of the fire with Hitler and Göring, close enough to hear what they said to each other. Hitler used to ask him what the British public thought about things, treating him as a useful gauge of London opinion. So on the evening of the 19th of July 1940, the man listening in that London studio was not some anonymous announcer. He was a man who had personally been asked by Adolf Hitler on more than one occasion to explain what the British were thinking. He did not ask anyone for permission. There was no time, and by his own later account, no inclination. He went on air in German, on the BBC German service, roughly an hour after Hitler had finished, and he addressed him directly. He began by reminding the Führer that he had sometimes consulted him in the past about the mood of the British public, and offered to perform that service one more time. And then he told him what Britain thought of his appeal to reason, that it was being thrown straight back at him, into his foul-smelling mouth. An hour. One broadcaster, speaking for nobody, with no authority whatsoever, in fluent Berlin German, in a tone of complete contempt. The effect in Germany was extraordinary, and Scheirer was standing in the middle of it. He records the officials around him in the Kroll deflating as the first British reactions came through that evening, a sort of badly hidden disappointment moving through the room. These were men who had come out for a victory party and had been told the war was as good as over, and now something had come back across the channel within the hour, and it was laughter and abuse. Goebbels' ministry could not process it. The speed of the thing convinced them it had to be official. Nobody, in their world, went on state radio and insulted a head of government without clearance, because in their world, state radio was the government. So they concluded that they had just received the formal reply of His Majesty's government, delivered with deliberate calculated insolence, 1 hour after the offer, before the British cabinet could possibly have met. They were wrong about every part of it. And being wrong made it worse, because they responded to an official rejection that had not happened, which meant that when the real one came, it landed on ground already burned. There is a footnote to Delmer that I like too much to leave out. The Gestapo kept a list, the Sonderfahndungsliste GB, a special search list of people to be arrested immediately once German forces landed in Britain. Nearly 3,000 names, Churchill obviously, and Sigmund Freud, who had been dead for a year because the filing was not perfect. Sefton Delmer was on it, with his own entry. He found out after the war and was rather pleased. The formal British answer came 3 days later, on the 22nd of July, and history rarely arranges its ironies this neatly. It was not delivered by Churchill. Churchill's view was that Hitler did not merit a personal reply from him at all, and there was some calculation in that. Answering personally would have made it a conversation. So the job of rejecting the German peace offer on the radio went to the Foreign Secretary, to Halifax, the man who, 8 weeks earlier, had wanted to find out what the terms were. He went to a microphone and said that the speech contained no basis in justice and no recognition of the right of other nations to govern themselves, that its only appeal was to fear, and that its only argument was a threat. And he said that Britain would not stop fighting until freedom was secure, for itself and for others. The leader of the peace faction reading out the refusal. Whatever else you want to say about Halifax, he did it properly. He did not resign. He did not brief against Churchill afterwards, and he never publicly suggested that he had been overruled. He took the job of shutting the door, and he shut it. And so the Germans printed the leaflets and dropped them on Somerset, and the villages of England sold them for the Red Cross, which left annihilation. Hitler had specified the alternative himself in front of the Reichstag, and now he had to produce it. Through August, the Luftwaffe came. The main effort opened on the 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day, with a plan to destroy RAF Fighter Command in the south of England inside a few weeks and clear the sky over the invasion beaches. It did not work, and the reasons are worth stating plainly because they are not romantic. The Germans had no accurate picture of British fighter production, which was actually running ahead of German fighter production that summer. They did not understand the radar chain or the control rooms behind it, so they attacked the masts a few times, failed to knock them down, and moved on to other targets. Their bombers were medium types designed for supporting an army, and they could not carry enough. Their best fighter could reach London and stay over it for a matter of minutes before it had to turn for home or swim. And a German pilot who came down over Kent was out of the war, while a British pilot who came down over Kent could be back on a squadron the same week. The fighting through late August was the closest it came. Airfields in the southeast were being hit hard enough to matter, sector stations were being damaged, and pilot losses were running ahead of replacement. Then, in early September, the weight of the attack shifted to London, and on the 7th of September, the bombers came up the Thames in daylight, and the Blitz began, and it went on, night after night, for months. That was the annihilation on offer. 43,000 civilians dead by the following May. Coventry gutted in a night in November. 1 million homes damaged in London alone. This is what Britain had chosen to risk in a committee room in May rather than find out what Berlin would ask for. But Fighter Command was not destroyed. On the 15th of September, the Luftwaffe put in a maximum daylight effort against London and was met all the way in and all the way out. And the German crews who had been told repeatedly that the RAF was down to its last few squadrons flew home through those last few squadrons twice. 2 days later, on the 17th of September, with air superiority nowhere in sight and the autumn weather closing on the Channel, Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. It was never formally cancelled. It was pushed to the spring, and then quietly stopped being mentioned, and the barges that had been assembled in the ports of Belgium and northern France were sent back to their canals, some of them having been bombed at their moorings by the RAF in the meantime. The invasion of Britain simply stopped existing, without an announcement, the way abandoned plans do. And here is the thing about all of this that took decades to become visible. Almost none of it was known at the time by the people it happened to. The cabinet crisis stayed sealed. The Pritz telegram stayed in a Swedish file. Delmer's broadcast was one voice on one evening and was not written up anywhere as a national moment. What survived was the paperwork. Diaries, minutes, telegrams, a war correspondent's notebook, an intelligence file, the Gestapo's arrest list. Somebody wrote it down at the time, for their own reasons, and that is the only reason we can stand here now and reconstruct 3 days in May with any confidence at all. That is how the past actually survives. Not in monuments, in paperwork, a morning report, a muster roll, a form filled in by a clerk who never once thought he was writing history. If your own family has one of those boxes, a name, a photograph of a young man in a uniform nobody can identify anymore, a handful of objects that were never explained, then the record of what he did is very probably still sitting in a file somewhere. I put everything I know about reconstructing an American serviceman's war into a book called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it is linked in the description below. Because of course they came. That is the part of the story that runs off the far end of 1940. Britain stayed in the war, which meant Britain stayed an island in the wrong place, and 4 years later, that island was the assembly yard for the largest amphibious operation ever attempted, packed with something like 1.5 million American servicemen, whose names went into those same files, none of which was visible in September 1940. What was visible then was a war Germany could not end, and that unfinished business did something to Hitler's thinking that turned out to be the largest consequence of the whole affair. Go back to Halder's diary again, and to a conference at the Berghof on the 31st of July 1940, 12 days after the Reichstag speech and 6 weeks before Sea Lion was shelved. Hitler laid out his reasoning to his senior commanders, and the logic runs like this. Britain will not make peace. Britain is holding on because she is hoping for someone else to enter the war. Those someones are Russia and America. America is not ready and will take time. Russia is next door. Therefore, if Russia is smashed, Britain's last hope on the continent is gone, and Britain will have to come to terms. He put a date on it. Spring 1941. That is the origin of Operation Barbarossa, stated out loud, as a way of getting London to answer the telephone. You can argue, and historians do, about how much of that was rationalization. Hitler had wanted a war in the East since the 1920s and had written it down at length. He did not need Britain's refusal to want Lebensraum. But the timing came from the West. The decision to go east in 1941, rather than deal with Britain first, to open a second front while the first one was still open, and to do it on a schedule set by frustration, was made by a man who could not understand why an island with no army would not accept a reasonable offer. 3 million men went into the Soviet Union the following June. Something like 27 million Soviet citizens died over the next 4 years, and the German army bled to death in that country, and the road from Berlin's confusion in July 1940 to the ruins of Berlin in April 1945 runs directly through that decision. The men in this story came apart in different directions. Neville Chamberlain, whose vote in the last week of May made the difference and who almost nobody credits for it, resigned from the government at the end of September, too ill to continue. He died on the 9th of November 1940, 7 weeks after Sea Lion was postponed, knowing that the invasion had not come, and knowing that his own name was going to be attached forever to the other thing. Churchill spoke at his funeral and said that history would judge him kindly on his motives, if not on his judgment, which was as generous as it could honestly be made. Lord Halifax was sent to Washington as ambassador in December 1940 and stayed for the rest of the war and beyond. It was a removal dressed as a promotion, and everyone understood that, and he did the job well. He got on with Roosevelt. He toured American cities and got pelted with eggs by isolationists in Detroit, and reportedly remarked that it was a shame to waste good eggs when the British were rationed to 1 a week. It is the best line anybody in this story produced, and it came from the man who wanted to talk to Mussolini. Galeazzo Ciano, who kept jumping up to salute in the Kroll Opera House, turned against the war and voted to remove Mussolini in July 1943. His father-in-law had him shot at Verona in January 1944, tied to a chair, facing backwards. His diaries survived, smuggled out by his wife, and became one of the most damaging documents ever produced about the inside of the Axis. Hermann Göring, holder of a rank invented for one man, watched his air force fail over England and never really recovered his position, though he kept the baton and the uniforms and the looted paintings. He was condemned to death at Nuremberg and took cyanide in his cell the night before the executions in October 1946, which is the last time he successfully got out in front of somebody else's decision. The Duke of Windsor spent the war in the Bahamas being a nuisance at a safe distance and lived until 1972. And Sefton Delmer, the man who answered a conqueror without permission and got himself onto an arrest list for it, was pulled out of the BBC and put to work doing something far stranger. He spent the rest of the war running Britain's black propaganda stations, radio channels that pretended to be German. The first was Gustav Siegfried Eins, fronted by a foul-mouthed, invented character called Der Chef, a disgruntled Prussian officer who complained bitterly about party corruption and sexual scandal in the leadership while sounding utterly loyal to Germany. Later came Soldatensender Calais, which broadcast real German dance music, real football results, and accurate news mixed with poison, and which was listened to by German troops who could not work out whose it was. Some of them assumed it was theirs. That was the point. The man who was told as a boy in a Berlin classroom that he was the enemy spent 4 years talking to Germany in its own voice, and Germany listened. Which brings it back to the leaflets in the hedgerows. A last appeal to reason. They meant it. That is what is so hard to hold in your head at this distance. It was a real offer, made by a man who believed he was being generous, to a country he expected to be relieved, on the assumption that any government presented with those facts would behave rationally. And the answer was no. Not because Britain was braver than everyone else, and not because the outcome was ever obvious, and certainly not because the decision was unanimous, because it very nearly went the other way in a room in Whitehall on a Monday afternoon in May, while the army was still on the beach. It was a decision, made by 5 men, saved by a dying chancellor's vote, and 25 junior ministers who cheered at the right moment, and then kept quiet for 30 years. Berlin asked a question that summer, and expected an answer within a week. It got one within the hour, from a man nobody had authorized, in perfect German, and it turned out to be the shape of the next 5 years.